Welcome to the UN Brief. Today we interview Ambassador Federico Villegas. He is the President of the UN Human Rights Council for the year 2022. The UN Human Rights Council has created a new special rapporteur position on the right to clean environment. This past week, a draft resolution has been adopted at the General Assembly in New York. This is very timely as we are seeing the impact of global warming not only in Europe but also in Southeast Asia, where temperatures reached 62 centigrades in some places last April. The UN Brief spoke with Argentina's ambassador to the UN in Geneva, Federico Villegas, who was appointed as president of the UN Human Rights Council for 2022 to discuss how the international community is on board to make the mandate for the new special rapporteur as impactful as it needs to be. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much, Ambassador Villegas, for accepting our invitation at the UN Brief to discuss the impact of the UN Human Rights Council on the legislative processes around the world. The UN Human Rights Council has created a new special rapporteur position. This is very timely as we are seeing the impact of global warming, not only in Europe, but last April in Southeast Asia, where temperatures reached 62 centigrades in some places. Ambassador, do you think the international community is on board to make this mandate as impactful as it needs to be? The special rapporteur said in its first press conference last June that the onboarding of Russia and China was a work in progress.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the invitation. And journalists and the press are also part of the actors that help the whole human rights pillar of the UN work. And so it's very important this type of opportunities to discuss what we do. There are always three roles in the Human Rights Council that are very differentiated. One is, as you know, the Universal Periodic Review, where you look at the human rights situation in every single country, and it's working very well, starting the fourth cycle. And there you have many recommendations regarding the environment. So this issue that we are addressing now with this question is also addressed in the Universal Periodic Review in different countries. Then we have another role, which is address urgent, serious human rights situations in certain countries. And those mechanisms, as you know, every session we have, unfortunately, several cases. Some of those cases involve displacement and climate issues, but most of them are for gross or systematic violations or alleged violations in those countries. And the third one is the one that we are dealing with now, which is a sometimes silent role, but it's very important, which is being the place and the mechanism for the progressive development of human rights, standards and norms. We are the hub, the juridical hub, where new standards and laws are created. And that is how we ended up with the landmark decision last year, after 20 years of discussions on environment issues from an environmental point of view, from a social economical point of view, from a scientific point of view. We approved this human right to a safe, clean, and sustainable environment. So definitely, I think that combination of this right having been accepted at the Human Rights Council of General Assembly soon, combined with the decision to create a special rapporteur on the impacts of climate change on human rights, are another proof that the progressive development of human rights is a work in progress, because you have to look at the perspective always in these cases. This revolutionary idea of international law of human rights has only 77 years old. So this is absolutely nothing in historical terms. What we are witnessing with technology and human rights, with human rights and environment, and many other issues, is the tip of the iceberg of what's to come. So I think it's very, very auspicious that, unfortunately, reality, science, our experience with these record temperatures here in Europe, everything proves that these mandates are more timely than ever. And so I think I'm very proud to be part of a system that was able to live up to the current circumstances of a need to have a human rights approach to issues that normally do not have a human rights. It was not easy. It was not easy because, I give you just one example. Several national legislations and some regional instruments have acknowledged a human rights perspective on environmental issues. But many of those advancements were resisted by the environmental people, basically because they thought that the human rights approach was another world that shouldn't be mixed with the environmental approach. The environmental approach, in the long discussions in all the different international organizations and the negotiations of different agreements, including the Paris Agreement on climate change, etc., you do not have human rights discussions there because human rights is something from Geneva that has another hat, another scope, another job description, so we shouldn't mix. So we had a kind of a resistance to have a human rights approach to environmental issues because they always thought that human rights is a political issue, and you can politicize environmental issues that should be based on science. Now that is over. That discussion, that dichotomy is over. We realize there's no development and sustainable development without human rights, the same way that there's no peace and security without human rights. So the idea of the three pillars, human rights, development, and peace and security, is more accepted than ever. And that is why we have a huge opportunity to put the Human Rights Council at the forefront of the discussion of a human rights perspective. And if you look at the priorities of the Special Rapporteur on the climate change, I was so lucky to be presiding the day he presented his first report. You could see the attention of all the people on what he was saying, because people felt that what he was talking was the future of our children. What they are going to experience and the challenges they will have. This involves, the most vulnerable people, and we are seeing indigenous peoples and displaced people and migrants. Therefore, I think we will develop, my perception is that we are at the witnessing a new whole track of progressive development of human rights related to the environment and climate change. That this is the starting point, and we have many years to go developing this. Justice, of course, is something that is there, and the vulnerability, but the accountability we need. Look, for example, the business and human rights. The whole idea of of business and companies and their impact on human rights has been going on in the Council for over 10 years. We approved the guidelines. We are even negotiating a possible binding instrument for states to regulate, the work of business and their impact on human rights. But if you look at those discussions these last years, 10 years, they were practical, but mainly theoretical. Mainly, they were talking about theoretical, how do we put international human rights law in the hands or in the responsibility of private sector, non-state actors that do not sign international treaties. And now with environment, with climate change, we see the importance of that work with the business and human rights, because we will bring all those 10 years of experience and discussions on business and human rights and put all that to work, those discussions in addressing this issue, because we know, let's be honest, we cannot just pushing a button from a government office change what's happening with climate change on the impact on the environment. Unfortunately, this is something that goes beyond a government's decision. This is a collaborative effort. We need business, we need the press, we need the NGOs, we need everybody. It's a collective effort to change and reverse what's happening. Without the private sector, without the business realizing they are part of the solution and they have to work with the government with a human rights perspective also. This is not a corporate social responsibility that you just do some good work for the image of your business if you have money to spare. That's another story from the past. Now they are actors of human rights, also the business, and more than ever in climate change and environment, we see that as a reality. And hopefully we have good news from the GA. Like many other times, the progressive development starts in Geneva, the kitchen, and in the restaurant, you deliver the main dish, and a GA resolution acknowledging at the most important body, the human right to a safe, clean, and sustainable environment will be a great achievement for the UN system.
Tomorrow they vote at the General Assembly, right, for adoption of this resolution. Now, and during your tenure, we are seeing a number of reports that foster the promotion and protection of human rights in areas that till recently were not on everyone's radar, just like you mentioned, the business community, right? The impact of new technologies on gathering evidence and its double-edged sword, as some tools can be used for surveillance of political dissidents and journalists. And another area that is just now gathering the deserved attention is the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, meaning addressing age discrimination in its various forms, in employment, in healthcare. And in particular, I would like to point to the latest report of the independent expert, Dr. Claudia Mahler, on the intersection of gender and ageism. What in her latest report caught your attention?
The latest report, Claudia Mahler has put exactly the spot on the huge vulnerability we have of women, older women, in the context of, for example, COVID, and also the insecurity that older persons experience because the social network and protection is weakened every time that a state decides to use resources for something else than to protect older persons' rights. That's why we have been working very closely with Claudia Mahler, because she was able, I give you an example. In the last report, she talked about ageism and discrimination based on age. And that concept of ageism, which is different from aging, as you know, for 10 years, we have been in the open-ended working group in New York, working on aging, basically. And the name of the group is aging. And aging comes from the development and population world. On the discussions. So was part of a social phenomenon of aging in a population, the same way that you can address childhood, for example. So aging was a population issue. So when we started discussing it from a population point of view, we've discovered that it was a human rights issue. And there are huge human rights gaps of protection for older persons. And then we went to another stage, which is, if we see that there is a protection gap, can we fill it up with an international instrument, or is just each state that should decide if they are willing to protect or not the rights of older persons? And definitely with Claudia Mahler and her last report on ageism and COVID and everything that happened with older persons during the pandemic, all those theoretical discussions became the face of real people suffering during the pandemic, older persons that were not able to get out of their house and they didn't have people to bring, basically nutrition because they couldn't even go to the supermarket, or the attention in their own homes and the financial insecurity. So now I think we are building the case, the international community, for a new international instrument for the protection of the rights of older persons. This is a process. It's not something that happens from overnight, but we already had 3 very important experiences by which the international community realized there was a group that structurally had a vulnerability to defend themselves, their rights, and needed an international instrument of protection. We had with women, which is the oldest and most systematic discrimination ever, the discrimination against women, and we had CEDAW and a whole instrument. Then we had with children, the most ratified convention in the world, and children's rights, and we changed the culture on how to look at children after that convention. We started talking about the rights of the child, the interest of the child, etc. And then we had a huge cultural change through an international instrument, which was the Convention on the Persons with Disabilities. And if you look at the success of the convention for the protection of the persons with disabilities, has made a cultural change on the way to approach persons with disabilities. And huge concepts of autonomy, etc., were emanated from that instrument. So what we think, a group, important countries, and of course Claudia Mahler, is that now is the time to look at a new international instrument for the protection of older persons, because they do have also a structural vulnerability for many reasons, for ageism, for this society that sometimes enshrines and praises youth, and there's a model of discarding sometimes the older persons because they think that they are not part of the solutions or they are not part of the society. And what we discover is that it's an attitude, but in order to have a good attitude when you are aging, you need the state to protect your rights, and you need the international community to have an instrument. If you have that protection, you can have an active aging and be part of a society. So I think it's very important, and I'm looking forward to all the work with Claudia Mahler, and I think the next step, it might take some years. Persons with disabilities took 7 years, and actually the Convention on the Rights of the Child started in early 80s, and it was 92 that was approved. So, but I think we have a good perspective on this.
This community too can step up by supporting older people who are now returning to work, right? Because some cannot afford to retire or want to be participants of the economy, and they sometimes cannot. And businesses can also provide support in terms of hiring intergenerational demographics in their offices and businesses, right?
Excellent.
So since these horrific images beamed across the screens all over the world showing police brutality towards African Americans and people of African descent in the US, and by the way, these types of violations of human rights by law enforcement happen in other countries too. But it was the murder of George Floyd by a police officer that was recorded on a smartphone by a bystander that sparked outrage and social mobilization in May of 2020. High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet issued a report that introduced a four-point agenda to end systemic racism and human rights violations by law enforcement against citizens of African descent. Also, the Human Rights Council established the International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. What should we expect of these initiatives? How to move from debate to implementation by country members? What needs to happen?
Thank you. Well, this is a very important question because this proves the flexibility of the Council to address human rights situations that systemically need an approach, urgent and serious approach. Usually, as you know, the murder of George Floyd occurred in May 2020 when Geneva was in full lockdown due to COVID. The Council was unable to meet at the beginning, but then as soon as it was lifted, the Council resumed the session. And the first things that they did was an urgent debate on George Floyd. And that's how we ended up approving a resolution, a historic resolution without a vote, that's very important, by consensus, on promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of Africans and of people of African descent against excessive use of force and other human rights violations by law enforcement officers. So their request to the High Commissioner to prepare a report, a very important report that you mentioned, on systemic racism violations from law enforcement officers towards African descent people, resulted in this group of experts, a very important group of experts that were appointed, that they are having a diagnosis around the world on this type of racism on law enforcement officers against people of African descent. The four-point agenda is the idea of a transformative change for racial injustice and equality, racial justice and equality. The High Commissioner called on states to translate the agenda into action plans and concrete measures developed through national dialogues and with the meaningful participation of people of African descent. And also she recommended to establish a specific mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement in all parts of the world. Of course, in that case, we need, as she pointed out, we need to to see and measure the relevant patterns, incidents, the policies, the processes, and the laws that each state has to combat this type of racism. Independent expert mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement is working very, very thoroughly in different cases with a visit to specific states. And of course, one of the states they will be visiting, if they haven't done so already during the mandate, is the United States, where this whole issue started. If you look at the names of those independent experts, they are very, very prestigious experts that I'm sure they will make a transformative change on this issue. At the same time, what I would like to point out is that we have different mechanisms in the Human Rights Council that will contribute to this cultural change on racism by law, on African descent people, and by law enforcement. We have, a special mechanism on people of African descent. We have approved a forum on people of African descent, and the same way that at one time we approved a forum on indigenous peoples, and that forum in the past of of indigenous peoples, was the one that started the creation of a draft declaration, Universal Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, which is a fact now. We have it. So now we are having this new forum, and I just appointed the 5 members that the President of the Human Rights Council had to appoint to complement the 5 members that were elected by the General Assembly. So now we have 10 experts, 5 elected by the General Assembly and 5 appointed by the President of the Human Rights Council, and those 10 will start addressing the systemic issues that affect people of African descent all over the world. And of course, this issue of racism on behalf of law enforcement officers will be part of the discussions and will be another contribution to the independent mechanism that we have created. So I think that this is a very important achievement also of the Council.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Federico Villegas, President of the UN Human Rights Council for 2022. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Pleasure in speaking with you, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest in the work we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe